Kyle had never been the kind of man to settle for less. Every morning, before the sun had a chance to stain the sky orange, he was already in the garage, hands buried in grease, tools clanking in his relentless pursuit of perfection. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was an artist, sculpting metal, oil, and horsepower into machines that roar with life. And for as long as he could remember, there had been one machine, one dream that burned hotter than anything else: the Ducati Panigale V4. It wasn't just a motorcycle. It was proof that his sacrifices, his sweat-drenched nights, and his calloused hands meant something. Proof that hard work pays off. But ambition was a hungry beast, and it demanded everything. Kyle worked 2 jobs: his regular shift at Jack's Auto Garage and his side hustle, restoring classic bikes for private buyers. The pay wasn't glamorous, but every dollar he pocketed was a step closer to owning his dream bike. His life was a routine of long hours, missed calls, and canceled plans, but that was the price of greatness. He lived for the thrill of progress, watching the savings in his Ducati fund grow, inching toward the moment when he could finally straddle the beast and own the road. But not everyone saw things the way he did. Sophia had been patient. At first, she admired Kyle's dedication. There was something intoxicating about a man so driven, so utterly consumed by his passion. But that admiration soured into frustration. Kyle had promised her a future, not just one with a motorcycle, but one with them together. Yet more and more, it felt like she was in competition with a machine she had never even seen. She tried. God, she tried. She would stay up late, waiting for him to come home, only to hear the garage door roll open at ungodly hours. When he wasn't working, he was talking about work, rambling on about engine torque and exhaust systems as if they were poetry. Their dates turned into rush dinners, their conversations into one-sided monologues about how close he was to his goal. She wanted to be happy for him. But more than that, she wanted to be seen. And lately, she wasn't sure Kyle saw her at all. One night, Sophia leaned against the doorway of the garage, arms crossed, watching Kyle fine-tune a custom Harley for a client. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, clinging to his skin like a second layer. He was in his element, lost in mechanics, oblivious to her presence. "You know," she said, forcing a smile, "I barely see you anymore." Kyle wiped his hands on a rag, barely glancing at her. "I know, babe. Just a little longer, all right? I'm almost there. You've been saying that for months." This time, he looked up, but not with understanding, with irritation. "Soph, we talk about this. This is important to me. And what about us? Are we important to you?" A long silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Kyle sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and finally stepped away from the bike. He wrapped his arms around her, pressing a grease-stained kiss to her forehead. "You know I love you," he murmured. "I'm just so close." Sophia closed her eyes, breathing him in. She wanted to believe him. But the weight of loneliness was becoming unbearable, and somewhere, deep down, a part of her had already started to drift. The changes were small at first. Sophia's text became shorter. She stopped nagging him about coming home early. The frustration in her voice faded, not because things had improved, but because she had stopped expecting change. One night, Kyle noticed her laughing over her phone. A real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard in a long time. "Who's that?" he asked casually, tightening a bolt on the Harley. "Just Ryan," she said too quickly. Kyle paused. Ryan, a name that hadn't been in their conversations before. "Ryan who?" She hesitated. "A friend from work." Kyle let it go. Maybe he was reading too much into it. But later that night, as Sophia showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message preview lit up the screen. "I can't stop thinking about tonight. Can't wait to see you again." Kyle stared at the words, heart hammering. The garage, the Ducati, the sacrifices. Was he working so hard that he lost the one thing that mattered more than any bike? He looked at the screen again. For the first time in years, Kyle felt something crack inside him. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just in his head. Kyle had always believed that if you worked hard enough, you could have everything you wanted: success, love, respect. It was all within reach if he were willing to grind for it. But life didn't work that way, because while he was pouring everything into his dream, someone else was stealing what he never thought he could lose. Ryan had entered Sophia's life so effortlessly, it almost seemed planned. He was charming, successful, and, most importantly, available. Where Kyle was always busy, Ryan was always there. Late-night office drinks, lunchtime conversations, a ride home when it was raining, little moments, insignificant on their own, but together they formed something undeniable. It started with harmless laughter, then inside jokes, then texts that stretched past midnight. Then one night, Ryan kissed her. Sophia had pulled away, breathless, guilt lacing her voice. "I have a boyfriend." Ryan had only smiled. "Then why didn't you stop me sooner?" She had no answer. And that silence, that tiny moment of hesitation, was the beginning of the end. Kyle was too busy to see it happening. He had thrown himself deeper into work, convinced that once he got the Ducati Panigale V4, everything would fall into place. "You're going to kill yourself working like this, man," Jake, his co-worker, muttered as Kyle wiped the sweat from his brow. "It'll be worth it," Kyle grunted, tightening a bolt. "Almost there." Jake shook his head. "Yeah? And when's the last time you actually saw Sophia?" Kyle hesitated. "She knows what I'm doing this for." "Does she?" Jake's voice was sharp. "Or is that just what you tell yourself, so you don't have to look at what's really going on?" Kyle didn't want to hear it. He pushed down the unease, burying himself deeper into work, believing that love, real love, was unshakable. But love wasn't just about endurance. It was about presence. And Ryan had more of that than Kyle ever did. The first time Sophia let it happen, she told herself it was a mistake, a drunken mistake, a lapse in judgment. But when she woke up in Ryan's bed the next morning, the truth was much uglier than that. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And the worst part? She didn't regret it. With Ryan, she wasn't just a woman waiting at home, the afterthought in someone else's ambition. She was seen, touched, desired. When Ryan looked at her, it wasn't through a haze of exhaustion or obligation. It was hunger. He made her feel alive again. So, the next time it happened, she didn't fight it. Neither did the time after that. Or the time after that. At first, Kyle ignored the signs. The late nights, the guarded phone, the way Sophia pulled away when he tried to hold her. He told himself he was imagining things. Until one night, when Sophia walked in, smelling like a cologne that wasn't his. Kyle didn't say anything. He just watched as she avoided his eyes, muttering something about a long day at work. He wanted to believe her, but something felt wrong. And when he accidentally saw Ryan's name flash across her phone screen, his stomach turned to stone. His mind screamed at him to confront her, to demand answers. But instead, he just stood there, watching, waiting, dreading the truth he already knew. One evening, Kyle got off work early, a rare thing. For once, he didn't tell Sophia. He wanted to surprise her, take her out for dinner, maybe make up for the distance between them. But when he pulled into their apartment complex, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Ryan's car, parked outside. Kyle's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could have walked away right then, could have driven off and pretended he never saw it. But Kyle had never been the kind of man to run. So he stepped out of his truck, walked up to the apartment, and pushed the door open. The first thing he noticed was the smell, the scent of sex and sweat and betrayal hanging in the air like a ghost. Then came the voices, low, intimate, too familiar. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife even deeper, he heard Ryan's voice. He's too busy with his bike to even notice. Sophomore, Kyle didn't need to see anything else. The weight of the moment hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. For years, he had bled for his dream, believing that hard work would give him everything. But in the end, it had cost him the one thing he never thought he'd lose. He could hear his heartbeat, feel the slow-burning rage coiling inside him like a live wire. But instead of kicking the door open, instead of giving them the reaction they expected, Kyle did the one thing neither of them saw coming. He turned around, walked out, and never looked back. Kyle didn't remember getting into his truck, didn't remember turning the key, or the way the engine rumbled beneath him. All he knew was the road stretching ahead, dark, endless, and empty. His hands gripped the steering wheel, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw was locked, teeth grinding, his entire body wound like a spring that might snap at any second. He could still hear Ryan's voice, smug and certain. He's too busy with his bike to even notice. Sophomore, Kyle had noticed. He had always noticed. But he had trusted her anyway. And now, that trust was nothing but wreckage, scattered across a moment he could never take back. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove past the city limits, past the neon signs and gas stations, until the air smelled like asphalt and open sky. He pulled over at an empty stretch of highway, killed the engine, and just sat there, staring into the darkness. He thought about the years he had spent building something real with Sophia. The sacrifices, the promises, the belief that, in the end, love would be enough. What a joke. Kyle let out a slow, shaking breath, then reached into the glove compartment. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, a habit he had quit 2 years ago, and lit one up with a flick of his lighter. The first inhale burned like hell, but it was nothing compared to the fire inside him. The next morning, Kyle finally went home. When he pushed the door open, Sophia was waiting for him. Her face was pale, eyes red-rimmed, as if she had spent the whole night crying. She started to speak, but Kyle held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his voice dangerously calm. She flinched, but she didn't look away. "Kyle, I know." His tone was flat, hollow. "I saw his car. I heard you." Sophia's face crumbled. It wasn't." "Don't lie." His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she had nothing to say. Silence. Kyle let it stretch, let her drown in it. Then, slowly, he exhaled, shaking his head. "I would have done anything for you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But you didn't want that, did you?" Sophia's lips trembled. "Kyle, it's not like that." "Save it." He turned away, stepping past her, done with his conversation before it even began. But before he could make it to the bedroom, Ryan stepped into the apartment. Kyle stilled. Ryan, standing there like he belonged, hands in his pockets, that same smug expression Kyle had heard in his voice the night before. Kyle let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Wow." Ryan smirked. "Figure we should talk." Kyle turned. "Slowly. Talk." He took a step forward, voice dropping. "You mean like how you talk to my girlfriend behind my back? Like that?" Ryan shrugged. "Hey, man, if you paid more attention to her instead of that bike, maybe she wouldn't have come to me." The room tilted. Kyle didn't remember moving, didn't remember grabbing Ryan by the collar and slamming him against the wall. But suddenly, there he was, chest heaving, fingers curled into fists. Ryan's smirk had disappeared, his confidence replaced by a flicker of fear. "Go ahead," Ryan muttered, eyes narrowing. "Hit me. Prove me right." Kyle wanted to smash his fist into Ryan's face, wanted to make him bleed, wanted to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused. But then out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sophia, tears streaming down her face, looking at him like he was the villain in all this. And in that moment, Kyle saw the truth. Ryan wasn't worth it. None of this was. Kyle let go. Ryan stumbled back, eyes flashing with something Kyle couldn't quite place. Maybe surprise, maybe relief, maybe disappointment. "You're not worth my time," Kyle said, voice steady. "Neither of you are." And then, without another word, he walked out. Kyle didn't stop walking until he reached the garage. His garage. The one place that had never betrayed him. The Ducati Panigale V4 was waiting there, gleaming perfect. Everything he had worked for. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he even wanted it anymore. He ran a hand along the seat, fingers tracing the leather. This bike had been his dream for so long, his purpose. But somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that owning it would fix everything. That once he had it, he would be happy. Now, standing there in the dim garage, with his entire world burning down around him, he finally saw it for what it was. The truth hit him like a fist to the gut. It had never been about the bike. It had never even been about the work. It had been about him, about running, about proving something to a world that never asked for proof in the first place. And in the process, he had lost everything else. Kyle let out a slow breath, closing his eyes. Then, without another thought, he swung his leg over the bike, gripped the handlebars, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, loud and unapologetic. And as he twisted the throttle, tearing down the street like a man escaping his own past, one thought filled his mind. It was time to stop running. The Ducati roared beneath Kyle, the engine's growl vibrating through his bones as he tore down the open highway. Cold wind bit his face, but he welcomed the sting. It was the first thing he'd felt in hours, maybe even days. The city lights faded behind him, swallowed by the darkness of the open road. No destination, no plan, just motion. For years, he had believed hard work paid off, that if he sacrificed enough, poured himself into something with everything he had, he would be rewarded. But what had it really cost him? Sophia was gone. The life he had imagined, gone. And now, here he was, alone with the only thing he had left. The night stretched on, the road stretching ahead like a path to nowhere. Kyle's mind raced, but for once, it wasn't filled with numbers and savings accounts and engine specs. It was filled with memories. Sophia's laugh on their first date, the way she used to steal his hoodies in the winter, the night she waited up for him, hoping for a moment of his time. And then, the look in her eyes last night. Not guilt, finality. The truth settled in his chest, heavy and immovable. He had lost her long before she ever touched Ryan. He had been so obsessed with proving himself, to her, to himself, to the world, that he hadn't even noticed she had stopped waiting for him to come home. Kyle's hands tightened on the handlebars. Was this really who he had become? An hour later, Kyle pulled off the highway into a gas station. He hadn't planned on stopping, but something in him needed a break. From the road, from the noise, from everything. As he stepped inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed above him, washing everything in a sterile glow. The cashier barely looked up as Kyle grabbed a bottle of water and walked to the counter. Then, from behind him, "Didn't think I'd see you out here." Kyle turned. Jake, his co-worker from the garage. The last person he expected to see at some nameless gas station in the middle of nowhere. Jake leaned against a shelf of motor oil, arms crossed. "You look like hell." Kyle huffed a bitter laugh. "Feel like it too." Jake studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the Ducati outside. "You finally get it?" Kyle hesitated. "Yeah." Jake sighed. "Man, I told you, you can't build a life on just one thing. You put everything into that bike, every hour, every thought, like it was going to fix you." Kyle swallowed hard. "I thought it would." Jake shrugged. "And now?" Kyle glanced out the window, staring at the bike that had once been his whole world. For the first time, it didn't feel like an achievement. It felt like a lesson. He exhaled. "Now I know better." Jake nodded. "So what are you going to do?" Kyle didn't answer right away. But for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what needed to happen next. Morning light was creeping into the sky when Kyle pulled up outside their apartment. The Ducati rumbled beneath him, but he barely noticed it now. He had come back for one reason. Not to fight, not to beg, just to close this chapter the right way. When he stepped inside, Sophia was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up, startled. "Kyle." "I'm leaving," he said, voice calm. Sophia's lips parted, but no words came. Kyle set his keys on the counter, rubbing his jaw. "I should have been there for you. I see that now. But I also know you made your choice." He met her eyes, steady, unshaken. "And now I'm making mine." Sophia swallowed hard. "Where will you go?" Kyle exhaled. "Anywhere but here." A long silence stretched between them, and for the first time in months, it wasn't suffocating. He wasn't leaving in anger. He wasn't leaving in pain. He was leaving because he finally understood what he needed to do. Kyle loaded a duffel bag onto the back of the Ducati, strapping it down. As he swung his leg over the seat, the weight in his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Sophia stood in the doorway, watching, and maybe, just maybe, she understood too. He looked at her one last time, then turned the key. The engine roared to life. And as Kyle pulled onto the open road, he didn't look back, because for the first time in his life, he was finally moving forward,